Just to add to the overall feeling of decadence, the late guitarist Johnny Thunders was replaced by Izzy Stradlin, formerly of Guns N' Roses, a band that also knew a wee bit about overindulgence. In this dissolute company, it was the Libertines, for once, who provided the voice of sobriety. Pete Doherty, meanwhile, was in a precarious position. The fact that he'd bolted from rehab twice suggested that he really didn't want to shake off his habit, rumoured to be costing £250 a day. There's no drug in the world that can compare with playing music, he said, although his actions didn't seem to back up his words. Then a chance of retribution came from a highly unlikely source. June Brown, the actress best known for playing the neurotic Dot Cotton in EastEnders, offered to subsidise a trip to a monastery in Thailand, thought to be the toughest drug clinic in the world. She had become interested in Tam Krabok, run by former United States Marine called Gordon Baltimore, when her godson was treated there for crack addiction. She even claimed to be a huge Libertines fan, although maybe she was getting them mixed up with Chaz and Dave, an act that might be expected to go down a little better in the Queen Vic pub. Tam Krabok is a whole different scenario to the celebrity cosseting handed out in the Priory. Inmates are fed on rice, water, and a herbal potion that makes them vomit any impurities from their bodies. To show respect for the local culture, they're forced to sing the Thai national anthem and to listen to tapes of chanting Buddhist monks. Any infraction of the rules is punished by beating, usually with a stout bamboo cane. On completion, the recovered addicts are made to sign a solemn vow never to touch drugs again. It was Pete's last chance, and he lasted 3 days before strolling out to sample the delights of Thailand's capital, Bangkok, not a place known for restraint or self-control. The next thing his bandmates knew, he was back in London, getting himself arrested for reckless driving and illegal possession of a flick knife. Carl's patience finally snapped. For all the love between the lead Libertines, he really couldn't stand Pete now, and announced that he was banished from the band, unless and until he could prove himself to be permanently clean. The Libertines had sacrificed too much in an effort to protect Doherty, and now they had to go it alone.
I think everyone's been looking for something that they can all be involved in a band, and there's kind of a bit of a sense of community starting to happen in England, especially with bands, and especially in the face of all your reality TV, Pop Idol, Australian Idol. I saw it on telly the other day.
Australian Idol?
Yeah.
Some rock bands make a virtue of being for real. An example is the Manic Street Preachers, whose striving for emotional and intellectual honesty nearly destroyed them and probably killed their guitarist, Richie Edwards. Others make a virtue of their artifice. Think of Slipknot, refusing to be photographed without their masks. Most hover somewhere between the two extremes, providing a cathartic dose of rock myth on stage and record, but a more down-to-earth persona in interview. The problem comes when the band members themselves lose track of the gap between myth and reality. The Libertines were always on this tightrope, striving for the mythical purity of Arcadia, but buffeted by the sordid reality of Pete Doherty's addictions. The subject matter of their lyrics was always lurching between the majestic and the banal, and their performances had a ramshackle grace that often threatened to collapse into disaster. The true story of Pete's ejection from the band in the summer of 2004 may never be known, because the various parties have different perspectives on it. Carl held to his views that Pete's removal from the picture was simply down to his drug addiction. If he stopped taking drugs, he could come back in. Pete, however, was back to denying that he had a serious problem, and implied that he was forced out because Carl wanted to dominate the band. According to Carl, the problems were happening before they'd finished making the second album. By the end of the recording, we were just sticking songs together, not really communicating, he said. We couldn't continue like that, so there was no choice. Pete had to go. The alternative would have been like driving through a car crash. Even the normally silent rhythm section chipped into the slanging match. It would be good if people just started concentrating on the music instead of the thing with Pete, said a disgruntled Gary Powell to the radio station XFM. Without wanting to blow our own trumpets, We're kind of an okay band, and the band is 4 of us, not just Pete and Carl. There is no doubt that the soap opera aspect of the Libertines' dynamics had raised the band's profile in the early days, but they had a new album to promote, and the press seemed more intent on salivating over the tensions between Pete and Carl. It was like the coverage of a particularly vicious divorce case. The group also had the misfortune that much of this took place in the summer, when the drooling ferrets of the red-top tabloids have little else to fill their chip wrapper pages. The Libertines weren't exactly A-list celebs for most Sun readers, not having appeared on Big Brother, but they do like a bit of sanctimonious tut-tutting over the drug-related bad behaviour of rock stars. The revelation that Pete also had a child by the singer Lisa Moorish had the hacks salivating even more. Moorish had previously made headlines by giving birth to Liam Gallagher's offspring when he was still married to Patsy Kensit. It was open season. But when the album arrived at the end of August 2004, it seemed that the band were as keen to keep the volatile relationship of the co-leaders at the forefront of everyone's minds. The cover featured Carl and Pete embracing at the Chatham gig that took place on the evening of Doherty's release from prison. They looked like the survivors of a shipwreck, clinging together, prepared to endure drowning rather than separation. Critics were happy to focus on the music, but it was as inextricably entwined with the band's traumas as Pete and Carl seemed to be with each other on the cover. The fact that the 4-piece that created it had effectively ceased to exist, whether that was permanent or temporary, heightened the collision between content and context. Can't Stand Me Now was the standout track for its combination of viciousness and poignancy. The boy kicked at the world, sneers Carl. The world kicked back a lot fucking harder. And we know which boy he's talking about. The maudlin Music When the Lights Go Out offers Doherty's perspective on his own transgressions. The band members also delved into their own scrapbooks of esoteric Englishness. What Became of the Lightly Lads casts Carl and Pete as the bickering heroes of the seminal Geordie sitcom of the 1970s. And The Man Who Would Be King echoes a story by the Bard of Empire, Rudyard Kipling, later made into a cult movie starring Michael Caine and Sean Connery. On the latter track, Pete takes a tip from Mark Bolan: when conventional words fail, lapsing into la-la-las can be just as eloquent. But there is also a sense that quality control has lapsed. On Don't Be Shy, Doherty sounds as if he's lapsing into a coma, which may be an accurate reflection of his physical state, but hardly makes good listening. Arbeit macht frei is just self-indulgent, and its title, the German for Work Makes You Free, from the signs above the entrances to Nazi concentration camps, is pretty tasteless. How queer indeed. The critical reaction tended to be that the second album failed to match the splenetic majesty of Up the Bracket, but that it was something of a miracle that it had been made at all. Mick Jones's sloppy production came in for a special pounding. Pete did his bit to keep himself on the agenda, even if he wasn't officially involved in the promotion of the album. A few days before the release of the Libertines, he was involved in a fight and managed to get hit by a car. His account of the event on his website, with references to delirious Arcadian harmony and the proverbial flappers of Albion, verges on self-parody and certainly qualifies as self-promotion. As if this wasn't enough, 2 days after the album came out, Doherty appeared for sentencing on the flick knife charge. In between, he played a gig with Baby Shambles in Reading, at the same time that his old colleagues were wowing the crowds at the festival in the same town. Hopes were high that there would be an emotional reunion, as happened at the Chatham gig after Pete left prison. This time, there was no reconciliation, no embrace.
He is more than welcome to come back to the band if he stops taking drugs.
He's wanted to come back to the band.
We all want him. We'd love him to come back. So.
Well, I don't know, obviously you've read our nasty press, but I think it's a choice between embracing life with the Libertines or death with the fucking Brown.
When the Beatles album, Let It Be, was finally released in 1970, more than a year after it was recorded, one underwhelmed critic described it as a cardboard tombstone dedicated to a band that was effectively defunct. When Strange Ways Here We Come appeared in 1987, shortly after Johnny Marr had broken up the Smiths, writers were keen to root out lyrical clues of disaffection and distress. When the Libertines' self-titled second album arrived, towards the end of the wet and windy summer of 2004, critics were in a quandary. Was the band dead? Was Pete coming back? Would it continue as a three-piece, or would the errant Doherty be replaced? Maybe it was premature to identify the album as the closure to a career. Instead, it can be seen as a kind of snapshot of two young men at a particular point in a fraught relationship. The future of the Libertines remains unclear. A few weeks after the band began to play again without Pete, the two main protagonists seemed to suggest that they were approaching a point of no return. "I can't see us doing any more writing or recording without him," said Carl of his estranged friend. "I think I'd rather end it." Pete, meanwhile, was expressing the same thing, in more aggressive terms. "I'm half of the Libertines," he declared. "By that I mean half the partnership signed to Rough Trade. They can't play a gig without me. He knows what's going to happen if he does. I'll stick a 1957 Epiphone down his throat and rip out his guts." Guitar snobbery aside, it seemed that, as with their idols, the Smiths, the final chapter of the Libertines' story might take place in a courtroom. The parallels were eerie. Both bands had signed to the same label, and both were, contractually speaking, a partnership of songwriters. John and Gary, for all their contributions, were, in Morrissey's words, the spare parts in a lawnmower, just like the hapless Andy Rourke and Mike Joyce of the Smiths. It's impossible to consider the story of the Libertines without feeling a degree of anger and frustration. Could they have achieved more had Pete Doherty not plunged headlong into the grubbier aspects of the rock and roll lifestyle? If Carl and Pete had been more mature about their relationship, would the whole mess never have happened? But that's like applying the sensible rules of an ordinary workplace to a creative environment. Part of the Libertines' genius was to chronicle the seamy tributaries of life. If Pete and Carl hadn't experienced them, the songs wouldn't have been so real. The streak of perversity and madness within the band led to fisticuffs and worse, but it also bred scintillating live performances, scabrous, inspired lyrics and records that will last when most of the Libertines' competitors are at the back of the bargain bin. If nothing else, the Libertines have resuscitated the art of the impromptu gig. Give them an electricity supply and a couple of dozen beard-up fans and they could play. Sound checks are for big girls' blouses. Rehearsals? Yeah, right. And the leaders' falling out was an inevitable result of a friendship that had been beyond close for many years. If they hadn't been so close, the pain and guilt associated with Pete's ejection from the band would not have been so intense. But without that intensity, the unity of vision, the mutual passion, it is unlikely that the Libertines would have progressed much beyond a few acoustic jam sessions. As someone pointed out, it's a thin line between love and hate, and Pete and Carl seem to pogo across the line several times a day. There's also a certain amount of self-mythologizing going on. Pete's antics clearly cast him in the mould of rock and roll martyr. Every time he gets into another scrape, the vultures consider his membership of what Kurt Cobain's mother called that stupid club. Richie Edwards, Sid Vicious, Jim Morrison. We can't know if Pete will be joining in the near future. But he's the only one who can decide whether or not the end will be a long time coming. Since day one, rock and roll has been associated with drugs and other manifestations of bad behaviour. But the story of the Libertines is not really about drugs, even though they gave the band a certain tabloid notoriety. It's not about the poetic ideals of Arcadia and Albion, although they gave a philosophy to the group that set it above the back-to-basics thrashing of their contemporaries. It's not even about the cathartic power of rock and roll itself, although tell that to the fans who demolished a venue in Stoke-on-Trent. And tell that to the music hacks who ditched their cynicism and heralded the event of a band that united the best aspects of The Clash and the Smiths. Instead, it's about the bond between two young men who realised that together they could create something bigger and more beautiful than the sum of the parts. As Pete Doherty sings in Last Post on the Bugle on the second album, "If I have to go, I will be thinking of your love." And maybe he has to go, and maybe it's all over. But the love remains. Essentially, the tale of the Libertines, from soap opera to farce and back again, is a story about love.
Thank you for buying Maximum Libertines. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. If you did enjoy it or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, Surrey, UK, KT36YY, or email on mail@chromedreams.co.uk. Details of our full catalogue are listed on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye for now.